I'd like to firstly introduce myself. I'm Tom Pretty, the Head of User Experience here at Coast Digital. Hopefully you're all here to learn a little bit more about biometrics today and haven't stumbled into the wrong webinar. When we get going, my aim for today is to leave you with a greater understanding of how biometric data sources can be used in a range of marketing contexts to improve performance and to help remove bias from sort of decision-making processes. We'll tap into a variety of things, including the emotions and physiological responses of users as they go through a variety of stimuli. But just to get started, I'll give you an idea of what we're going to run through today. So bear with me. There we go. What we'll be covering. So today's session acts largely as an introduction to the world of biometric testing. We've found that clients become hugely excited when we talk about the potential for biometrics, but on the whole, most haven't had much experience with the technology or really understand its capabilities. So I wanted to do today's session in two halves, really. One is to give you like some basic information on what we mean when we talk about biometrics, the types of sensors we use to measure users' emotions and behavior, and finally spend a little time looking at the logistics of running a study and exploring some of the typical outputs that you might get from a study. Then I want to move into, rather talking about biometrics in an abstract way, show you some real-world examples of the studies we've undertaken. So my hope here is that by talking you through some of the studies that we've run, we'll be able to show you the power that biometrics can bring to sort of a range of situations and help solve challenges across the marketing spectrum. So I'll finally wrap up with a few takeaways and hopefully should have some time for some questions right at the end. So the first thing I want to cover off is what is biometrics? So biometrics as a term covers a broad spectrum of technologies and use cases. We can hear in the press quite often about how biometrics can lead to invasions of privacy and how it's being used to improve medical diagnosis and treatment, or even being used by some nefarious governments. But at Coast, we aren't referring to any of that retina scanning or facial recognition stuff that is quite often in the press when it refers to biometrics. For us, we talk about biometric data sources and using them in a way that supports our user testing and research projects. We tap into the emotions that users feel when exposed to marketing collateral or digital experiences and provide statistical evidence to help shape design and marketing decisions. We've now been using our biometrics kit for about 3 years in the UX team here at Coast, and we found it amazingly useful, not to mention fascinating. The way it allows you to identify pain points, but also get evidence on which pain points are the most important, has really been groundbreaking to our thinking. It's kind of the dream as a UX professional to be able to have that data at your fingertips and sort of statistically identify where the problems are occurring the most. We've also been able to introduce biometric testing in scenarios above and beyond just usability testing of websites and apps. Increasingly, we're looking at marketing collateral, so imagery, video, and that kind of stuff. And through comparative studies, we're identifying like the styles of imagery or the types of imagery that elicit the greatest response and therefore should be used in marketing campaigns going forward. Essentially, with the kit at our disposal, we have 3 main data points that we measure. And I'll explore more of these in detail in the coming slides. But just as a sort of a top level, the first one we measure is something called eye tracking. So this allows us to pinpoint where the user is looking at any time in their journey. It's ideal for narrowing down UX problems or working out if a CTA is in the right place, for example. We use something called facial expression analysis, or FEA. Now this allows us to pick up users' emotional reactions to a stimuli, whether it's a website is frustrating them, or it's causing them anger, or if an image causes them joy or fear. We can pick that up with the emotions they express facially. And finally, we have galvanic skin response, or GSR. And this allows us to identify users' emotional arousal when exposed to certain stimuli. So whether something is exciting, gets them going, or conversely doesn't, we can identify the physiological response users have to a set of stimuli or a specific stimuli. But for us, it's combining the 3 data sources that allows us to get insight into the emotional and behavioral responses that users have. It basically tells us how users engage with websites or anything visual, and the emotional response that's elicited by the user experience. It's added a rich data layer on top of what we would normally find with our observation analysis. And basically it's allowed us to statistically identify pain points and provide much more focused recommendations and objective recommendations as a result. So I suppose the killer question here is, how exactly do we measure our users' emotional and behavioral responses when they're exposed to a stimuli? So the first thing we measure is a behavioral thing, which is eye tracking. Now this uses a small infrared bar that shines light into the user's eyes, and then through some clever maths, works out the angle of where they're looking. So we can accurately pinpoint areas of the page they're looking at and whether they return to anything. The outputs that come from this include heat maps, which you've probably seen, click heat maps and mouse cursor heat maps, and they show hotspots of attention. And the other thing is we can do is we can sort of draw, we can overlay shapes and overlay areas of interest on top of images and websites and that kind of stuff. And that can give us individual metrics on aspects of the design. And these metrics include things like time till first fixation. Now, that's a really useful thing for understanding the order in which users progress around a page, and therefore the visual hierarchy of that page and if that's working effectively. But other things that we look at include gaze duration, so that's how long they spend looking at things. And also revisits, so how often they return to things. It can really help and identify what is important information for users, and also what information might be being missed and needs more visual prominence and that kind of stuff. So that's eye tracking. That's one of the things we measure. The second thing we measure is facial expression analysis. So this uses a basic webcam, but within the webcam there's a piece of software that tracks action points on the face. I think there's 32, and they include your eyebrows, your eyes, your corner of your lips, your nose, your chin, a whole load of different action points around the face. And by measuring these action points and entering that data into an algorithm based on real human responses of facial expressions, it can measure 7 core emotions being expressed by the user. So essentially this algorithm gives a quantifiable probability of the emotion being expressed. So we can say if something's making someone angry or happy, or something that someone's surprised by something as part of a user experience. What it doesn't really give us is an indication of the strength of that emotion, but what we do is we run multiple tests with multiple participants so we can aggregate this across a number of users. And essentially that means we can identify pain points in a grouped way and sort of really hone in on pain points, barriers, moments of delight. And so it's a real useful tool for that. In terms of metrics, we tend to use a percentage of the time a particular emotion is being expressed. And when you aggregate that again across a participant pool, you can ascertain emotional trends across user experiences or within specific visual stimuli. So that's the second thing we measure. The third thing we measure, and the final data point, is something called galvanic skin response, or GSR. Now, essentially, this is the sweat response to external stimuli, which is not quite as gross as it sounds. Most of us know about fight or flight as a concept, but as humans, we have another state called rest and digest. And this rest and digest state, so where our bodies are comfortable, they're at 37 degrees, they're happy digesting their food, it's where our bodies are happiest and where we like to spend most of our time. The body is always trying to get back to that state because that's where it's most comfortable. So if we become stressed by an external stressor or excited, even in a small way, our body temperature goes up subconsciously. And in response, our body has to sweat to bring it back down again. And so by measuring this micro sweat through electrical conductivity on the hand to a small sensor that sits across the palm, we can identify these little peaks and troughs in what we call emotional arousal. So these GSR peaks don't necessarily give us a positive or negative finding, as arousal can mean both excitement or fear at the two ends of the spectrum. But what it does help and identify an aggregated level is the strength of an emotional response to aspects of a stimuli or an experience. And again, this is kind of that underlying physiological, really strong response that users have, whereas FEA is a little bit more superficial than the GSR findings. So they're the 3 things we measure. And as I said, it's the combination of the 3 that were really useful to us. So if I move on to running a biometric study, there's one thing that we need to get right before we start a study, and that's the main thing here, is to say that for us to get good findings and an effective study, it's really sensible to plan and have a solid research question. So just like any scientific investigation, it works best if we have a well framed out and thought out hypothesis or area of exploration. We quickly learned when we first got our hands on the biometric stuff and we started using it that just doing biometrics doesn't necessarily result in great outcomes. For the best results, what we like to do is work closely with our clients on identifying exactly what it is they're wanting to find out, what stimuli they need to be testing to allow us to find that out, and then how that's going to lead to the best outcomes that we get from it. It's also fair to say that we don't always use every data input that we have available to us. In some instances, we may drop GSR as it's unlikely to give us any data, or in others, we will include self-reporting surveys as a means of better understanding user responses over and above what the data is telling us. And what else do you need to get started? So the first thing, as we said, you have to have a well-framed research question or hypotheses. That's the first thing. The second thing that we try and settle is what stimuli are we going to test? So we can work with pretty much anything visual. We have done some visual physical testing as well with additional kit, but the majority of the studies we're doing work with visual stimuli. And this includes websites, designed up prototypes, TV adverts, banks of collateral and imagery, display and social media adverts. We've even done some stuff with search engine result pages for some of our SEO team to understand how people engage with those. And in longer studies, what we can do is we can combine different stimuli. So we can test multiple things in a single study, which makes the most of each participant as we have them. So the first thing is identifying exactly what we want to test. Second bit of logistics really, I suppose, is where. And there are a number of things we can do here. So the kit itself is actually relatively mobile. It's a laptop and a few sensors, and we can set it up pretty much anywhere, although we do prefer it to be somewhere quiet to avoid too much sort of external noise and stimuli. But this can be an office, an event, a shop floor if we can find a sort of quiet corner, or even a showroom or something like that. We also have a dedicated lab at Coast offices that we regularly use for our testing. And then in the wake of the pandemic, actually, we've actually started doing some remote testing as well. So this is like unmoderated testing. I suppose the compromise here of being remote and we're getting the tests out there is that we can't obviously measure the GSR because we can't put any sensors on anybody, but it does give us some rudimentary eye tracking as well as the facial expression analysis. So we can run studies remotely as well, and that's been a really good advance in the last 12 months in response to the pandemic. And then finally, who do we want to test with? So identifying like who we need to test with. Typically, we try and test with an in-market audience, your customers, users, or staff. But this isn't always possible. In some scenarios, and one that comes to mind is sort of high net worth individuals, we can struggle to get hold of sort of in-market audiences. In these instances, we tend to use a cold audience. It depends what you're testing, but I don't find it's not always a huge issue to use a cold audience. It depends the type of challenge that we're setting people and the type of task we're setting people as to whether it's a problem or not. So they're the three things that we try and tick off before we get started. And then another key question we quite often get asked is, what do the results of a biometric study look like? And this is where we can show you a few outputs here. So most frequently you'll see these sort of eye tracking heat maps. You can see on the right hand side there, this is from like a social ad test that we ran. You can see how users are fixating on the subject of the ad, the brand, but also some of the areas of interest. We can give an order of how the users are engaging with that ad. The bar chart at the top is a representation of a journey, like a user journey going through and booking a test drive for a car. And what we can do is we've mapped here the negative facial expressions against the steps in the journey. We can see a clear peak at that prices and specification step. And that helps us diagnose that that's obviously a problem and worthy of further investigation. And the final one at the bottom is GSR peak. So this is show the same social feed with multiple ads in and seeing where and how they appear and whether there was a GSR spike that related to them as an idea that actually leading to, as an idea of giving us an impression of whether those ads are performing well or not. With those three things, and it's not always, they're not always mutually exclusive, we quite often combine them, we're able to make some sort of common findings. And these include interaction behaviors with websites, apps, prototypes, that kind of things. UX issues, blockers, and journey improvements are other things that come up very frequently when we do tests. And then the emotional responses to marketing imagery or video, attractiveness of ads, and we even did some stuff into understanding sort of product packaging and stuff like that. And this, as I say, it's the combination of those three things that allow us to sort of come to these findings. So, having sort of explored the basics of biometrics and what it is and how we sort of run and test and the type of things we get from them. In this section of the webinar, I wanted to run through some example studies to give you a feel for what's possible with biometric analysis. We've used it in a wide variety of applications, typically using digital stimuli, but have a broad spectrum of other stuff. In each of these sort of studies, what I wanted to do is pull out the thought process of what we were testing, the types of findings we make when we do these studies, just to give you a feel for the takeaways and the types of things you can find out. Obviously, some of the findings are going to be relatively specific to that client or that company, but there are some general things that hopefully you'll be able to take away. I've chosen on 4 distinct areas. I mean, I could do a webinar just on the UX side of stuff that we've run, but for the sake of broader appeal, we'll cover off studies into a broader range of things. The first I want to touch is a UX of a car manufacturer's website. The second is responses to banks of marketing imagery for a pet food company. Third is responses to a television advert for a stairlift company. Finally, I want to look at a product packaging comparison study that we did for the same pet food company as well. So these studies are presented as abridged versions, as I'm relatively conscious of time, but again, they should give you a good feel for the types of things you'll be able to get. So the first study that we did was this car buying UX one that we're going to present today. So we set the user the task to learn more about the Subaru XV, find different engine sizes and types, and then find the cost of a 2.0 SE Lineartronic model. Now, we sent them to the Subaru website for this, and then asked to find the price of this specific model to analyze pain points in the journey, and any sort of potential UX improvements that might come off the back of it. As you can see, the visualization sent 30 people through it, and then put the then put them through the website, and then post survey data on sort of rate of it, ease of completion of the task, and that kind of stuff. The first thing that pops out and we look at quite often is the facial expression analysis, and we sort of led to this on the outputs chart, the output slide previously. But what we can see here is the emotional responses at each step in the user journey. So the majority of users went from home page through to the product page, through to the prices and specification page, and then to book a test drive. And we can see from that top chart on the top right that the negative facial expressions, or the average time of that, was highest on the prices and specification page. Now this immediately leads us to say, okay, well, that's worthy of further investigation. That's something we want to drill into further. What we can then do is pull out individual emotional responses to that. So we've chosen anger and contempt here. Anger it's not always that people are getting angry at the website. It's hard to get, well, people do get angry with websites, but it's more that people are furrowing their brow, scrunching up their face as they're starting to get confused and frustrated. And contempt is a similar facial expression. The lips curl up on one side, there's a slight smirk, that kind of thing. And that's kind of people just, again, getting frustrated or getting to the point where they're almost going to give up with the website, sorry, because it's not working in the way they expected it to. So both of these things are really sort of letting us hone in and pinpoint that this prices and specification page is well worth a look. So the next thing we would do is go through some of the videos that we have of people testing. And this is a sort of a live demo of a biometric study that we've recorded. And there's a few things to note on this display before I sort of play the video. The first is the user view. So that left there that's the user. And you can see those little white dots on the user's face. They're the action points that are being tracked as we want to understand the emotions that is being expressed. On the right-hand side, in the middle of the black box, is a mobile view of the site that they're on. And the yellow dot is where they're looking. So that's where their gaze is laid at any time. And the larger that dot becomes, is more how long they're spending fixating on something. So you can track that around. Something to note is how fast that yellow dot moves, but also how much it grows when they have to fixate on something specific. And finally, at the bottom there, you've got the sort of the live data readout of anger and sadness. And we've pulled those out because there's some clear trends there for this user as they go through this table and they're looking for the specific piece of information that we've asked them to, and they can't find it. There's a spike in anger, and that leads to a raised base level as they still can't find the data. So if I hit play on this, you'll get a feel for how this works. So you can see the user, they've already found the correct model, and now they're going down trying to find price, and they're scanning through as quickly as they can, scanning through, reach the end of the table, and there's a shake of the head, and then there's a confusion because they haven't found price at all. And okay, so then this raised level of sadness and anger is caused by the fact the user is now just sort of blindly trying again to find the information and just going through the same process. And that's why it's this raised level. His brow is now much more furrowed. There's a shake of the head. That would lead to a contempt trigger as well. And with this one user, we were able to identify that actually it's this table on the price and specification page which is causing quite a lot of the problems. So how do we then dive into a greater level of detail and find out exactly what's wrong with this table? So that's where the eye tracking really comes to its own, because at an aggregated level, we can then create areas of interest over parts of the table where the users are engaging. So we can see here, those numbers refer to the order in which the users engage with that element. So they first see the model switcher with the two arrows either side, then they go down to the table and they start searching for information there. Remember, they're looking for cost. What they don't see, and quite often until they've reached the end of the table, is that prices is top right, almost hidden away in that top row, and people aren't seeing that until third. So the users are skipping over what is quite key information in that table. So after finding this out and presenting it back to the client, we made a clear recommendation to them that reordering this table is essential, because the tabs at the top don't necessarily work with the varied UX that you've got going on, with a slider to change the model, and also these expandable boxes to actually get the detail. And as I say, it's just added confusion to the user, and this is what causes the frustration in that journey. So we're quite confident to be able to tell them that you fix this, you're going to fix a lot of the journey. As well as the UX of that site, we also spent some time playing with imagery and having a feel for what type of imagery we should be using on the website as well. And so we tested these 5 groups. So we had the interiors, the off-road, the on-road. We had sort of lifestyle shots with people, and then sort of the plain backgrounds. Basically what we did is we showed them each group of images in a randomized way with sort of blank slides in between to break things up. And what you can see here is what we call a bee swarm. So this is users engaging with the interior. Each one of those dots is an individual gaze of a user as they're looking at the imagery. So you can sort of see the kind of things they're looking at and the order in which they're looking at them. What was really interesting that jumped out of this one is that when you show a background image as part of an interior shot, people engage with the outside of the car so much more, that to the point where they're actually much distracted by that surfer who's just walking out of the water. And it raised an interesting point to us where we were thinking, actually, this lifestyle versus non-lifestyle imagery sort of dynamic is really worth investigating further. So what we did is we took this further and we looked at the FEA for this as well. So for this one, we looked at average of negative facial expressions as well as the average of positive facial expressions. And what we found is that those shots with people and lifestyle in had a much higher positive response than those that without, and particularly those that are just the non-background shots. We did sort of say that actually potentially the negative reaction was to the styling because there was nothing else in that photo. The elevation of the people at this point and the lifestyle shots was definitely worth us investigating, and definitely worth us sort of starting to make a recommendation that if you're going to start promoting, put families in, put landscapes in, because that's the kind of stuff that people are having a good positive reaction to. And then just to take this further, this is where we can sort of build the data that we've got. On the left-hand side, we have our facial expression analysis, and on the right-hand side, we have our GSR. And actually, it lines up that they're having a stronger reaction to the people shots, those of beaches and cars and families, and that having a stronger physiological reaction as well as an expression reaction. Add to that argument that if you're going to choose any images to put on the website or in your brochures, then actually these ones are going to leave your users with the most positive result and positive impact. And then finally, just to sort of flog this horse a little bit more, I suppose, is that we dived even deeper to look at the individual images, and we looked at the ones that created the largest amount of joy. So, you know, joy or happiness. This is characterized by the user smiling at the image. And what we saw here is that actually beaches featured massively in all of the positive images, the most positive images. We found that, yeah, beaches featured heavily. And so our recommendation to the client was to utilize more lifestyle shots and specifically focus on beach shots they had in their image library to make the most of these images and make the most of the positive reaction that users were going to have. So a couple of sort of key findings from this sort of user experience study was a negative emotional response correlates strongly with those points of frustration and annoyance. And it really helps us sort of pinpoint those UX issues. And the other thing was eye tracking, much more accurate than click or cursor maps. The eyes move much faster and often completely independently of the mouse. And we see that very often when we've done these kind of studies. So moving on to our next study, this was a purely image response study. So similar to the car one, but this one was much more in depth and with more users, and we did it in a much more sort of controlled way. But what we would do is we essentially sat the users down in front of the screen and said, you're about to be shown some images, there's nothing else for you to do. And we compiled 33 different images in 11 different image groups, and they were each presented to the users in a randomized way, in a random order, and the images themselves within group were randomized. And then there was a spacer in between, and then we followed up with a survey which asked unprompted questions, so which photos stood out to you the most, but then also prompted ones. We asked them to rate some of the images that they remember seeing and that kind of stuff, just to sort of tie together, because it's quite important to get this self-reporting stuff going on, because it helps tie the data together that we're recording with the biometric data sources. And in the same way, I'm not going to show all 11 groups, but we had sort of groups of images such as cats with people, dogs with people, and then cats playing with toys in a black and white background with contrasting colors. And there's just like a style of the images that we were sort of testing with the users. So the first thing we looked at, as typical, is the facial expression analysis. So in this instance, we focused less on the negative side. Funnily enough, when you've got in-market dogs and cat owners doing your tests, they smile at pictures of dogs and cats, which, you know, isn't necessarily a massively scientific finding or groundbreaking, but what it does tell us is which type of images they like the most. And we can see here that the black and white images where the puppy or the kitten is the sole focus of the photo did much better in terms of joy response, in contrast to the way that the cars were presented in their own way. Dogs did slightly better than cats. That might be that dog owners smile more at their animals, who knows? But this just started to sort of shape our thinking that actually the black and white imagery and this sort of the sole focus imagery was well worth investigating further. Then the next step is just identifying how people engage with these images from a eye tracking perspective. So you can see here that people really do focus on the faces of animals when they're all these pictures of animals, but also the eyes. And that middle picture of the dog big puppy dog eyes, and there's a clear view of them looking at both eyes, either raw, and not looking at much else. And that's a really striking image, and did very well in both the GSR, the FEA, and also the eye tracking and recall as well. So that this type of thing could impact image choice, not just for pets, I think, but also like in broader advertising as well, because people really do engage with the eyes, and we've seen it in a lot of studies that we run. So yeah, that was a real sort of takeaway that we took from that making sure that the face of the animal is visible is something that they should consider for their marketing. And then as again, we're adding GSR into this. And what we can see here is, this is the deeper reaction that people have. This is a bit more of a physiological one. In terms of our facial expressions, we tend to express facially what we think might be a social cue quite often. We are social animals. And back in the day when we were all monkeys, we'd use our facial expressions to communicate with each other. So we quite often have sort of a superficial facial expression reaction, but it doesn't always line up with GSR. And where they do, that's quite interesting. But also when GSR jumps out on its own, that's very interesting, because that's quite a strong physiological reaction that people are having to that style of imagery. And in this instance, you can see the two of the top are animals playing with contrasting colours. And I think that's a thing to hang on to, and something we'll investigate a little bit further. Really interesting. Also, that picture of the dog lying down did well, far and above any of the other imagery in that group. And that's another one that we chose, probably because of those really striking eyes, that we thought was worth taking through to sort of the further analysis. And then finally, we asked users about what they would recall, and this is unprompted recall, so which images stood out the most. You can see there, the animals playing with red objects sort of stood out the most. That really sort of hit home to us that there's a strong correlation between the GSR response, but also the recall. It allowed us to make two recommendations. One is, if I'm putting together some display ads, we want red objects contrasting with the animal. And then if we want to make the ads additionally striking, that dog laying down is a real winner in terms of ones to use in marketing campaigns in the future. A couple of key findings for that was images that have large faces, and importantly in sort of engaging eyes in the forefront, resonate really well with users. And then contrasting colours used for feature points to improve recall. Something worth testing outside of the world of animals, I suppose, but we definitely saw it in this test with the animals. The third study I wanted to run through today was how we tested a TV ad. So what we did is we showed the users 3 different adverts from 3 different stereo lift companies. And they were in randomized order, and there was a survey at the end to ask, which one they thought was best and that kind of stuff. And the purpose here really was to understand the aspects of the client's advert which landed most successfully, and how users reacted throughout, but also how that advert compared to its competitors in terms of the response that it picked up. So the first thing I'll just show you the ad. And this is the bee swarm of the ad as we go through, and you can see again here. You can see how people engage with eyes and faces and mouths. This is how we watch people talk, which is again always fascinating to watch. But the premise of this ad is that the child's going to sleep. It wants its bunny, so the granddad goes downstairs and they spend a while hunting for the bunny. There's a blowout of the actual product here, and they start looking for the bunny again. He takes the bunny back up, and the kid says, "Oh no, I can't sleep. But bunny needs his teddy to go to sleep." And there's a little laugh, and they end the ad. That's essentially the premise of the ad. What we're able to do with that is then cut the ad up into scenes and apply the data that we have to it. So we can statistically look at which part of the ads caused the greatest emotional response, and which didn't, and importantly as well. And what we found is actually there's a good correlation between joy percentage, people expressing joy, and also having a GSR response on that hunt for the bunny. So that premise, that first "I need to find my bunny" type thing, and actually going off looking at it worked quite well. There's a good sort of response to the premise. But what you will see is that whilst there's a bit of a peak at the end for the final joke in terms of the joy response, it doesn't actually correlate with a GSR response. And that's what we would call like a superficial reaction to something, because it's like saying someone tells you a bad joke in a bar and you sort of laugh and give them a bit of a sympathy laugh. We do that when we watch television as well, it would seem. And we sort of, the social cue is to laugh because we're being told a joke, but it's not having a really strong sort of physiological reaction. And arguably the recall would be poorer for it. But what we were able to do by looking at this, rather than tell them that the joke didn't necessarily land so well, is actually we were able to look at those middle parts of the ad and say, these aren't causing a strong emotional response. If you had to cut it down, these are kind of the areas that we think that you could snip out, particularly that I think it was scene 4, the second part of hunting for the bunny. they could cut that out without losing too much of the emotional impact of the ad. And then also, of course, we showed it against the others, and what we can do is measure, we can measure engagement, and this is the amount of time that users sort of directly looking at the ad, fully focused on it. And we can see they were much more focused on the ad of the client ad of the stairlift company 3, and they showed more joy as well. It also lined up with the way that the participants felt which advert was best. So this gave us a good message to take back to the client, and that they could share internally with their marketing team and say, you know, the ad has outperformed X, Y, and Z, which was a really good positive message and a sort of a good value add that we were able to put into that study. So I suppose the key takeaway here is placing humor inside your ads, it will cause a reaction, but this reaction is rarely deep, and it's really, you know, it's really a deep response that really strikes users. Quite often it feels a bit more of a sympathy laugh type thing. Final study I just wanted to run through today was the product packaging study, as I feel it's one of the more interesting ones we did. So what we wanted to do is understand the interaction behavior with product packaging, and also how naming can impact sort of the user understanding of a product. So we showed people pictures of pet food, and we asked them to imagine looking at them if they were shopping for their pet. We did this in a couple of ways. So we actually had 2 runs, because we were testing old versus new packaging. So we showed people stills of a single product to see how they would engage with it, and then we asked them, you know, who they thought that product was for, or what type of animal, or you know, what species, whatever that was. And run A was showing the new products, run B was showing the old. But then what we did is we showed the products side by side to get to ascertain which ones were most attractive, and then we asked them which you'd prefer to buy. And that was our way of sort of understanding whether we could assign a purchase intent versus the old versus the new products. And so just a short view of this is, on one of these products you can see here, so the older packaging is on the left hand side, the new is on the right. And you can see that there's a much broader spread of focus, because users are engaging with the entirety of that sort of information panel, whereas on the newer packaging it's a lot more focused, or a lot, you know, there's less sort of on the sort of the highlighted information. And this is making us think that actually the older packaging did much more better in terms of the product understanding, so you know who this product is for. And yeah, the reason why I found this interesting is because the older packaging had much more prominent product information on the front, whereas it was in smaller font on the newer, and it's a bit more hidden away, so it's harder for the user to engage and understand. When we go, you know, dive into that in a bit more detail and put areas of interest over it, we can see that whilst users spent quite a lot of time getting to that product information on the newer packaging, whereas they were quicker to get to it on the older packaging. Again, driving that hypothesis that the larger font is doing a better job of helping users understand who the product was for. And then the final aspect, as I said, we showed users side by side the 2 images to see which ones they'd look at first and how long they'd spend looking at them. And we can see here that the old packaging, people tended to get to it in like half the time. So after 1.6 seconds, that's the TTFF at the top, the time till first fixation. And on the second one, it took them sort of 2.7. And these were randomized left and right as the study went on. It wasn't always presented left and right. But the time spent is almost double on the older packaging, which means users are spending longer looking at that, which correlated with about 60-40 split of intention to buy the older packaging versus the new. So in this instance, like we obviously didn't say, you know, we'll stop producing the new designs altogether. What we did say is maybe reconsider the packaging design initiative straight away until you've done a little bit further research, maybe some focus groups, maybe some more traditional research to identify actually, is it performing better and does it jump off the shelf in a better way? And that was just an interesting way we sort of fed into teams sort of broader, not just about marketing, from one of our biometric studies. So key takeaways there for us really were adding larger branding and product names doesn't necessarily improve the user's understanding of the product or even their intention to purchase. And then that font size or the way you lay out the information on the product, on the packaging, also like to play an important role of how customers engage with the product and understand what it's about. So look, hopefully that's given you a sort of a brief view of the types of things we can study and also the types of things we can find out. Yeah, my impression is it gives us some real interesting talking points and some hard data that we can make recommendations on. And it always impresses me when we can play those back to the client and sort of demonstrate in a really objective way, you know, these are the changes you need to make. There's a couple of takeaways that I just wanted to run through. So look, we think this biometric testing is hugely exciting, but deploying it in the right way and investing in study design is vital, right? So you really want to plan your studies and your research in sensible ways. Make sure you've got a clear research question that will specifically benefit the project. That's, that's fundamental if you want to get good conclusions. Most visual stimuli can be tested. So whether you've got videos, imagery, websites, prototypes, you can put most of that into this system and into the kit. And we can test a lot of things in quite a varied way. We always get asked about numbers, whether it's traditional user research or biometric research. But for a pure UX study, so looking at the user experience provided by a website, I'd say, minimum we're looking at about 10 to 15 people is what we try and test. If you're looking at analysing the emotional and sort of physiological responses with a degree of accuracy, not just for UX, but also for like imagery and things like that, we tend to recommend around 30, just because you quite often have to cut around 1.5 to 5% of people because you have your outliers. So you really want to have a larger data pool so you can be statistically significant when you start to make the findings. For us, we find the best results happen when you do it in a physical location, particularly if you can get somewhere quiet. And for some of those sort of emotional and physiological tests, it's really handy to have a quiet room where the external stimuli are minimized. Although this remote testing options is available, and we can use that. I think that if the time pressures of the project came up, or if we had a very hard to reach audience, remote testing is definitely something we would go down. For us, two of the key areas, it's great for unearthing UX issues. Those emotional triggers really help us identify like points of frustration and help us through the eye tracking, help us pinpoint interaction behaviors. And it works well with comparative stimuli, especially when we're sort of doing like how does video 1 compare to video 2 or image 1 with video 2. That's where we can get some of the real good findings from it. And I thought I'd also just give you a quick view of some of the things that we've found out since using the biometric kit. So one is that you can't necessarily rely on click and cursor movement heat maps for accuracy. We've consistently found the eye moves much faster and much more independently from the mouse than we first thought. I was doing a test a couple of weeks ago, and the user completely left the cursor at the top of the page and then spent 10 minutes reading a table. That's not stuff you would be able to pick up from click maps or from cursor movement maps. So you're really missing a lot of engagement by not seeing what the eyes are looking at. Users really do engage with the eyes in any image that you put in front of them, the faces. We saw the example with the puppy, but we've tested it with people, with snakes, with spiders, with babies, you name it. And people always engage with the eyes. They're really important interaction points. And if you want striking collateral, forward-facing eyes really do help to stand out. We're really surprised just how much copy gets skipped. And as a copywriter, it does, it does make me feel sad to say it, but large paragraphs or heavy copy really does get skipped all the time. People really want to just dive into the interactive elements or the finer scannable bits of information. And then on that note, I suppose product pages, we've done quite a bit of e-commerce testing, and what we've noticed that after engaging with the big sort of picture of the product, people always go to that interactive element, whether it's changing the color of the product, changing its size, what type of product it might be. People always spend a lot of time there and they focus on it really quickly. And the price, while you think it would be important, actually doesn't often come up. It's normally 4th or 5th in terms of the order in which people engage with the page. And I find that really interesting that it's not necessarily the most important thing to users when they're browsing. So it doesn't necessarily always deserve a large, prominent piece of the real estate on a page. And then just as a sort of a fundamental roundup, I suppose, for us, biometrics is the ability to empirically prove that one thing is better than the other, whether that's a design, an image, or a video. We can objectively say that is better than the other, and it really helps bring in objectivity to our discussions around website design or marketing campaigns, and that's why we find it such an exciting topic and why we've been sort of investing good time into it over the last few years. So that brings me to the end of the webinar. I was wondering does anybody have any questions? I think in your right-hand pane there should be a questions tab where people can open them up and add questions should they like to. Okay, so someone's asked me a question on how the remote works, and so essentially that works by using the webcam of somebody's laptop, and they have to go through various steps of calibrating that with eye tracking. So it uses the webcam for eye tracking rather than infrared. As a result, the eye tracking is a little less accurate, but it does allow us to do it in a remote way. I have a question. So do people respond well to being hooked up all the gadgets are tracking. It's an interesting one, and it's a fear that we actually, when we first started looking at it, I remember asking a colleague as we were testing it to take their wedding ring off because we needed to strap the GSR to their hand, which he was resistant to do, which is totally fair. But actually, we found pretty quickly that you don't have to ask people to remove certain things. We stopped putting, like, we have a heart monitor that was like another thing to strap. We did stop putting that on because that was a bit fiddly. But we found that actually when we ask people to put the sort of the GSR strap on, that's totally fine. Most people are happy to do it. We tend to wipe it in front of the person before they have it, so that they can see that it's clean, especially since the pandemic. And we always leave the option open of not wearing that part. The beauty of it is, I suppose, is that they're not really hooked into the eye tracking or the facial expression analysis. They just have to use the computer or the mobile in the normal way that they would, which is pretty non-intrusive. But yeah, on the whole, people are happy to be sort of strapped up to the GSR, particularly if you can show them the data it's recording and be quite open with it. Is there any more questions at all? What's the lead time to start a biometrics project? So in terms of lead time, so normally we have a planning stage, which is, depending on the complexity of the project, is usually sort of 3 to 4 days. We'd normally have a kickoff with the client to understand exactly what they want to find out. We would then work with them on which stimuli they want to test, and then put that into the system, into the sort of study design, which takes a while, because a lot of the stuff we do, we try and do it in a way that we can leave the room and do it in a relatively unmoderated way, so we don't impact the results. So you do have to think of a lot of sort of the different sort of aspects of making sure that they're getting the same tasks, and the tasks are pretty foolproof and all that kind of stuff. But normally, yeah, from the point where we kick off, we can be testing within sort of 3 or 4 days. And again, it depends on how we're testing. We'd normally test over sort of 4 days, and typically another sort of 3 days sort of right up off the back of it. I think that's it for questions. Okay. Well, I'd just like to say, look, thank you very much for attending today. I hope that you have found it useful and interesting. It's definitely a subject that we're really excited here at Coast, and we have been for a while now, as we are thoroughly fascinated by some of the stuff that we find out. And importantly for us is to remember that it's not an academic exercise for us. We're always using it in a way that we can tie back to value for clients. So whether that's smoothing out the pain points in a user journey, whether that's identifying which images or which products are going to sell best when you show them off to your users, we're always trying to find that angle to make sure it's as valuable as possible. And I think that's what we always try and remember. So I believe recordings can be sent out. I believe I'll double check with the marketing team on that. But I'd just like to say, thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.